It started in South Philadelphia in the late 1960s. Crap games above barbershops, heroin moving quietly through neighborhoods already under pressure. A handful of young men decided the street economy needed structure, discipline, control. By the early 1970s, that structure had a name: the Black Mafia. They built a syndicate with chains of command, secrecy oaths, and a reputation for retaliation. Witnesses stayed silent, rivals disappeared. Federal agents listened through wiretaps while bodies accumulated across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. This is the story of how the Black Mafia rose, how it ruled, and how its legacy carried into the crack era through the Junior Black Mafia, and how an organization built on fear eventually fractured under the weight of its own violence. It began in the neighborhoods of South Philadelphia during the 1960s, a period when the city was already divided by invisible borders. Crime had always existed in the inner city: numbers running, prostitution, small-time extortion, neighborhood crap games held in back rooms above storefronts. What changed in that decade was coordination. Independent operators who once worked alone began to recognize the profit in structure. The demand for narcotics, particularly heroin, was rising sharply. Street-level hustles were evolving into organized systems. In that environment, a new power center began to form. At the center of it was a man named Samuel Christian. Samuel Christian was born on March 20th, 1939. Over time, he would use multiple names: Richard Carter, Sam, Bayer, Christian, and later Suleiman Bey. He was a former Black Panther with an extensive arrest record before he ever built an organization. Physically, he stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed approximately 215 pounds. Law enforcement described him as thick-necked and powerfully built. He carried himself with force, and in the neighborhoods where he operated, reputation was currency. Christian's trajectory changed when he joined the Nation of Islam. After converting, he adopted the name Suleiman Bey. Within the organization, he rose to the rank of captain in the Fruit of Islam, the paramilitary wing responsible for discipline and security. That structure, hierarchy, and emphasis on obedience would later influence how he organized his own criminal network. Many early associates would also convert to Islam, giving the group one of its nicknames, the Muslim Mafia, or the Muslim Mob. By September 1968, the Black Mafia was formally established in Philadelphia. It was not a loose street gang. It was designed to coordinate and consolidate crime that already existed in Black neighborhoods. The group sought to centralize control over numbers, extortion of legitimate businesses, prostitution, and drug distribution. At the time, heroin was becoming the dominant commodity, and whoever controlled heroin controlled both money and fear. The organization began in South Philadelphia as what appeared to be a small criminal collective. Members initially participated in holding up neighborhood crap games, extorting independent drug dealers, working as numbers men, and operating illegitimate businesses. Those early activities were not random. They were tests of authority. Each successful intimidation sent a message to the community that a new structure was in place. The founding circle included Ronald Harvey, Henry Dabney, Richard Porkchops James, Donald Donny Day, Clyde Apples Ross, Robert Bop Daddy Fairbanks, Craig Heist Jones, Walter Hudgens, and Robert Nudie Mims. These were not outsiders drifting into crime. Most already had arrest histories involving violence. They understood the street economy and the importance of reputation. Several would later become Nation of Islam members, reinforcing the internal bond that tied religion, discipline, and criminal enterprise together. From the beginning, the group relied on intimidation to prevent cooperation with police. In neighborhoods where trust in law enforcement was already fragile, the threat of retaliation carried weight. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Cases were dropped when testimony failed to materialize. That pattern would define the organization for years. It allowed members to cultivate an image of being untouchable, which in turn strengthened their influence. The Black Mafia's formation did not happen in isolation. On the east side of Broad Street, Italian organized crime maintained its own sphere of control. Angelo Bruno, the head of the Philadelphia crime family, discouraged drug dealing in South Philadelphia. though arrangements with New York crime families, including the Gambino organization, continued to move narcotics into the city. As black organized crime consolidated west of Broad Street, an unspoken geographic understanding developed. Italian organized crime dominated one territory. Black organized crime solidified another. The drug trade crossed those boundaries when money demanded it. By the end of 1968, what began as a small, coordinated effort among local criminals had taken on a formal identity. It had leadership, it had discipline, influenced by paramilitary structure. It had ambition. And it operated in a city where heroin demand was climbing and fear traveled faster than any police report. The foundation had been laid. The next steps would be marked by violence, consolidation of territory, and the first internal betrayal that would define how the Black Mafia enforced loyalty. By the spring of 1969, the Black Mafia was still in its early phase, consolidating influence block by block. The organization had been formally established only months earlier, and its leaders were testing loyalty, territory, and control. On April the 19th, 1969, that internal structure faced its first major rupture. Nathaniel Rock and Roll Williams was one of the group's founders. He was part of the original circle that had helped organize the collective in South Philadelphia. That night, Williams arranged a crap game above a barbershop at Broad, also known as 14th Street and South Street. Crap games were common in the neighborhood and often involved members of the Black Mafia. They were also profitable. Money changed hands quickly, and whoever controlled the room controlled the cash. Several leaders of the organization attended the game. Williams, however, was noticeably absent from the table he had organized. During the game, two armed men forced their way into the room. They robbed the pot and stripped the players of their money. It was a clean stick-up, executed with speed. But in neighborhoods like this, rumors travel faster than police cars. Almost immediately, suspicions began circulating that the robbery had been engineered from the inside. Word on the street suggested that Williams himself had arranged the stick-up, using neighborhood gang members to carry it out, and had driven the getaway car. Whether he miscalculated or believed he could outmaneuver his own associates remains uncertain. What is documented is what happened next. Roughly an hour and a half after the robbery, witnesses saw two men escorting Williams out of a bar at 15th and South Street at gunpoint. It was a public display and it sent a message. His body was later discovered in an isolated area near the naval base in South Philadelphia. He had been shot 4 times in the back. Police would later characterize the killing as a Black Mafia execution. The message was clear inside the organization. Betrayal, or even the perception of betrayal, would be answered with lethal force. Loyalty was not negotiable. On August 12, 1969, Jerome Barnes was arrested for Williams's murder. Barnes was suspected of carrying out the execution. The arrest suggested that law enforcement was beginning to connect the dots around the group's activities. But the case quickly followed a pattern that would become familiar. Police were unable to secure witnesses willing to testify. In neighborhoods where the Black Mafia was establishing control, cooperation with authorities carried real risk. Fear of retaliation silenced potential testimony. Without witnesses, prosecutors could not build a case strong enough to proceed. Charges against Barnes were eventually dropped. The killing of Nathaniel Williams became more than an internal purge. It marked the beginning of a system sustained by intimidation. The organization learned that fear could neutralize prosecution as effectively as violence neutralized rivals. Witness silence was not accidental, it was enforced, and it was understood. From that point forward, the Black Mafia's reputation grew not only because of what it did, but because of what no one would say about it. By the end of 1968 and into the early 1970s, the Black Mafia was no longer operating as a loose street coalition. It had structure, it had rules, it had hierarchy. What made the organization particularly difficult to dismantle was not only its violence, but the discipline behind it. At its core, in 1968, the command structure consisted of 14 individuals. The average age among them was 29. They were young, but they were not inexperienced. Most had prior arrests, many involving violence. They understood the mechanics of street crime, and they understood the value of internal order. Titles were not ornamental, they defined power and access. Members and associates were categorized carefully. High-ranking participants were referred to as Part 1. These were decision-makers and trusted operators. Below them were lower-ranking members known as the Little Brothers. Advancement was possible, but it was not casual. Movement up the chain required meeting specific criteria established by leadership. Discipline was tied to status, and status was tied to obedience and earning power. Meetings were formalized. Between 1969 and 1975, gatherings were organized at different locations, shifting constantly to avoid detection. Attendance ranged from 40 to 60 participants depending on the level of the meeting. Separate sessions were held for those in positions of power and for general members. Minutes were taken during many of these meetings in the earlier years, reflecting a level of bureaucratic organization uncommon in street gangs. Security was methodical. Many members were transported to and from meetings while blindfolded by higher-ranking members. The purpose was clear: compartmentalization. No single participant could compromise a location under pressure because they did not know precisely where they had been taken. Upon arrival, members were searched. Only the presiding member had authority to decide who could carry weapons during the proceedings. Even among criminals, procedure mattered. A strict set of written rules governed conduct. Members were required to take a secrecy oath. That oath demanded not only silence about organizational activities, but also the reporting of any violations of that oath. The consequences were severe. The oath extended risk beyond the individual. It invoked potential harm to family members and associates if betrayal occurred. Fear reinforced loyalty. This emphasis on order mirrored Samuel Christian's experience within the Nation of Islam and the Fruit of Islam. The paramilitary influence was visible in the hierarchy, the rituals, and the expectation of discipline. The Black Mafia was constructing something that looked less like a street crew and more like a criminal institution. At the same time, the organization understood the value of public image. It created and used legally incorporated non-profit organizations as cover. These entities provided a public-facing presence in the community. On paper, they appeared civic-minded. In practice, they allowed the group to gather, organize, and sometimes channel resources while shielding criminal operations behind legitimate documentation. One of the most notable fronts was Black Bee Inc. The stated aim of this organization was to combat gang violence in the African American community. As gang conflicts increased in visibility, Black Bee Inc. positioned itself as a stabilizing force. City residents and local law enforcement, however, were aware that the Black Mafia exerted influence behind the scenes. The same organization presenting itself as a peacekeeping body was still encouraging violence when it served its interests. This dual approach, disciplined internal governance combined with outward community engagement, allowed the Black Mafia to entrench itself. It operated as both a feared criminal syndicate and a visible presence within neighborhood institutions. That combination complicated investigations. It blurred lines between civic participation and organized crime. By the mid-1970s, the organization's structure had evolved further. Later leadership iterations became less inclined to record activities on paper, recognizing the risk of documentation. But the foundation laid between 1968 and 1975 established the blueprint. Hierarchy, secrecy, ceremony, and controlled violence formed the backbone of the Black Mafia's power. It was not chaos that sustained them, it was order. By the late 1960s, the Black Mafia had moved beyond neighborhood hustles. The organization that began in South Philadelphia was now expanding its reach across the city and into the broader Delaware Valley. Heroin was the engine behind that growth. Demand in Philadelphia was accelerating, and whoever controlled supply controlled territory. The group consolidated significant portions of heroin trafficking within African American neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Distribution networks were built block by block, with enforcement mechanisms ensuring compliance. Independent dealers were pressured into cooperation through extortion or absorbed outright. Those who resisted faced intimidation or violence. The drug trade became the organization's primary source of income, and it fueled everything else. Expansion did not stop at the city line. Operations extended into South Jersey, particularly Atlantic City and Camden. Chester, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware, also fell within their sphere of activity. These areas provided both new markets and logistical advantages. The Delaware Valley functioned as an interconnected corridor, allowing narcotics, money, and personnel to move across state lines with relative fluidity. Alongside heroin trafficking, the Black Mafia engaged in traditional organized crime activities. Extortion targeted legitimate Black-owned businesses, as well as independent operators working within the underground economy. Loan sharking generated steady returns with high interest rates that kept borrowers trapped. Illegal gambling, including numbers running, remained a consistent revenue stream. Prostitution was organized and taxed. Racketeering schemes developed as influence expanded. Political corruption entered the picture as relationships were cultivated to shield operations and ease pressure. This growth unfolded within a city that already had established organized crime. On the east side of Broad Street, the Philadelphia crime family operated under the leadership of Angelo Bruno. Bruno discouraged drug dealing in South Philadelphia, at least publicly. His organization traditionally favored gambling and labor rackets over narcotics. Yet the reality was more complicated. Italian gangsters operating independently, sometimes described as renegades, engaged in drug transactions as long as financial obligations were met to Bruno and to New York families. An informal geographic understanding developed. Italian organized crime was described as operating east of Broad Street, while Black organized crime held sway west of Broad Street. That shorthand captured the division of influence in South Philadelphia for decades. The arrangement was not formalized in any documented treaty, but it reflected the practical balance of power on the streets. The Black Mafia also established connections with New York crime families, including the Gambino crime family. New York had long been a central hub for narcotics distribution, and relationships with established mafia networks allowed access to supply chains that extended beyond Pennsylvania. These connections strengthened the Black Mafia's capacity to secure product and move it efficiently. At one stage, Black New York drug lord Frank Matthews became a supplier. Matthews was known nationally for his role in large-scale heroin and cocaine trafficking. His involvement represented a significant link between Philadelphia's emerging Black organized crime structure and broader interstate narcotics networks. Access to a supplier of that scale meant higher volume, greater profit, and increased visibility. The expansion came with consequences. As the Black Mafia consolidated power, it influenced legitimate Black economic life within the city. According to contemporary accounts, some successful African-American businesses, including banks, medical practices, and property owners, relocated as segregation pressures faded and the climate within certain neighborhoods grew unstable. The criminal economy was becoming intertwined with the broader social fabric of Philadelphia. By the early 1970s, the Black Mafia had transformed from a localized criminal collective into a regional syndicate. It controlled significant portions of heroin distribution, maintained operations across multiple states, engaged in extortion and racketeering, and navigated a complex relationship with Italian and New York organized crime families. The structure built in the late 1960s was now generating serious revenue. With revenue came scrutiny, and as the money increased, so did the scale of violence required to protect it. By May of 1969, the Black Mafia had already demonstrated its willingness to enforce loyalty internally. What followed showed how far its reach extended beyond its own membership. That month, Pennsylvania Deputy Insurance Commissioner David Trulley was investigating an insurance fraud case. Trulley was not a street-level target, he was a state official, conducting a formal inquiry tied to financial crime. During the course of that investigation, he was attacked and severely beaten with a lead pipe. The assault was carried out by Richard Porkchops James, one of the early founding members of the Black Mafia. The beating left Trulley seriously injured. He lost 3 teeth and required 26 stitches to close his wounds. The attack sent a message that the organization was willing to use violence against public officials when its interests were threatened. It also showed that enforcement extended beyond drug disputes or territorial control. When business was at risk, retaliation followed. Richard James was already known to law enforcement. His record reflected repeated arrests, and violence was not unfamiliar territory for him. On November 23, 1969, James was arrested in New York City on a murder charge unrelated to the Truly assault. According to intelligence files from the Camden Police Department, James had been sent to New York at the direction of Eugene "Bo" Baines to carry out a contract killing. While in New York, he murdered a woman and a child and wounded the intended target, the man he had been hired to kill. Before James could be returned from New York to face proceedings connected to the Truly beating, he died in custody. Officially, the cause was listed as a drug overdose. Law enforcement officials, however, concluded that the overdose was likely a hot shot, a lethal injection of narcotics administered intentionally. The strike force investigating the Black Mafia determined that the overdose had been arranged to ensure James's silence in connection with the Black Mafia-related assault case. James had a documented history of 32 arrests by the time of his death. He was not an isolated enforcer. He was part of the organization's early backbone. His death in jail removed a potential witness who could have linked higher-ranking members to the assault on a state official. The pattern was becoming clear. Violence was used to enforce discipline. Violence was used to silence threats. And when a member posed a liability, even from behind bars, that liability could be eliminated. In 1969, the Black Mafia was still in its formative years, but already enforcement actions against it were colliding with a code of silence maintained through intimidation and, when necessary, lethal force. On January 4, 1971, the Black Mafia carried out one of the most brutal crimes in its history. It was not a street corner execution or a targeted retaliation. It was a calculated, coordinated robbery that left a city shaken. The target was DuBrow's Furniture Store on South Street in Philadelphia. 8 members of the Black Mafia entered the store separately, posing as ordinary customers. There was nothing unusual at first. Employees assisted them, unaware that they were watching a team assemble inside the building. Once all 8 men were in position, the robbery began. Guns were drawn. 20 employees were forced to the floor in the back of the store. They were bound with tape and electrical cords. Control was immediate and absolute. What followed went far beyond theft. 13 employees were beaten. 2 were shot. The violence appeared intended not only to subdue, but to terrorize. During the robbery, a janitor named Shane Albert entered the store while performing his duties. He walked into an active crime scene. He was shot and killed. He had no connection to the operation, no involvement in the store's management or finances. He was simply present at the wrong moment. The brutality continued. 1 employee was doused with gasoline and set on fire. Flames were also ignited in other parts of the store as the robbers attempted to destroy evidence of the crime. The building was turned into both a crime scene and a potential inferno. When the fire alarm sounded, the 8 men fled. As they exited, they deliberately trampled over one of the victims lying on the floor. The robbery had escalated into something else entirely. It was an exhibition of violence meant to demonstrate power. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Philadelphia Police Commissioner Frank Rizzo described the DuBrow robbery as the most vicious crime he had ever encountered. His statement reflected the scale of the outrage. This was not an isolated shooting in a neighborhood dispute. It was a coordinated assault inside a commercial business in broad daylight against defenseless workers. The crime drew national attention and became embedded in the city's memory. Author W.E.B. Griffin later used the robbery as the basis for his novel The Witness, further cementing its place in Philadelphia's cultural history. The fictionalized account brought the brutality of that day to readers beyond the city, though the real events required no embellishment. For the Black Mafia, the robbery marked a turning point. The scale of violence ensured increased scrutiny from law enforcement and media. The organization had built its reputation on intimidation and silence. After DuBrow's, it faced a new level of visibility. The money taken that day has never carried the same weight as the cost. A janitor lost his life, employees were left injured and traumatized, and the city saw in clear terms what the Black Mafia was capable of when profit and power converged. By 1972, the Black Mafia had entrenched itself in Philadelphia's heroin economy. With control came friction. Narcotics distribution at that level required trust between suppliers, middlemen, and street distributors. When money disappeared or agreements were violated, disputes escalated quickly. In that world, financial conflict often ended in bloodshed. One of the early victims in that year's chain of violence was Richard "Red Paul" Harris. Harris was shot inside a bar at 17th and Dauphin Streets in North Philadelphia. According to records, the killing stemmed from a narcotics dispute involving James P.I. Smith. Harris had allegedly cheated Smith during a drug transaction. In an economy governed by reputation, being accused of skimming or deception carried consequences that were immediate and final. The retaliation did not stop with Harris. James P.I. Smith himself was later shot in a parking lot at 3700 Brown Street in Philadelphia. His killing was tied to another layer of the same narcotics dispute, this time involving Tyrone "Fat Ty" Palmer. Smith was accused of cheating Palmer in connection with the Harris deal. The structure of these conflicts shows how interconnected the drug trade had become. One disputed transaction triggered a sequence of executions. At the center of this widening circle stood Tyrone "Fat Ty" Palmer. Palmer was known as Mr. Millionaire. He was a major cocaine and heroin dealer and served as the primary Philadelphia area contact for New York City drug suppliers. His position placed him at a critical junction between local distributors and larger interstate networks. That prominence made him both powerful and vulnerable. On Easter Sunday in 1972, Palmer was inside Club Harlem in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The club was crowded, with estimates ranging from 600 to 900 people present. It was a public setting filled with witnesses. In that environment, members of the Black Mafia carried out one of the most brazen assassinations in the organization's history. Palmer was shot in the face. Samuel Christian, the founder of the Black Mafia, was identified as the shooter. Before Palmer's bodyguards could mount an effective defense, gunfire erupted inside the club. The chaos spread instantly. In addition to Palmer, 3 women and one of Palmer's bodyguards were killed. Approximately 20 other individuals were wounded in the exchange. The assassination was not a hidden execution carried out in an alley. It was a public demonstration of power inside a packed nightclub. The message extended beyond Palmer. It signaled to competitors, suppliers, and associates that disputes would be resolved in full view if necessary. The killing brought federal attention to Samuel Christian. He was later added as the 321st person to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He was wanted in connection with the 1972 murder of Tyrone Palmer, and also as a suspect in the 1973 murder of Major Coxon. Despite the scale of the violence at Club Harlem and the number of witnesses present, Christian was not convicted of Palmer's murder. As in earlier cases, the absence of cooperating witnesses undermined prosecution. The events of 1972 revealed the volatility within the heroin trade. Alliances shifted, trust fractured, and the Black Mafia's leadership demonstrated that it would eliminate rivals in the most visible settings available. In crowded rooms, in front of hundreds, the drug economy had become a stage for public execution. On January 18, 1973, the violence that had largely revolved around narcotics and internal power struggles crossed into something far more ideological. That day, 7 members of a Hanafi Muslim family were murdered in Washington, D.C. The crime would become known as the Hanafi Muslim Massacre, and it pushed the Black Mafia from regional notoriety into national headlines. The intended target was Hamas Abdul Khalis, a Sunni Muslim leader who had publicly criticized the Nation of Islam. Khalis had written letters accusing Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, of being a false prophet. He also claimed that certain members of the organization were engaging in criminal behavior that discredited Islam. Those accusations created a serious ideological conflict. Carlis was not present at the home when the attack occurred. Instead, the assailants entered the residence and killed 7 members of his family. 2 adults and 5 children, ranging in age from 9 days old to 10 years old, were murdered. The adults and 1 child were shot. The remaining children were drowned in a bathtub. The brutality of the killings shocked even seasoned investigators. The victims were not involved in street disputes or narcotics trafficking. They were family members caught in the crossfire of a religious and ideological conflict. The massacre was attributed to members and affiliates of the Black Mafia. The connection between certain Black Mafia figures and individuals aligned with the Nation of Islam deepened scrutiny. The ideological dispute that began with letters and accusations had escalated into mass murder. The difficulty of securing evidence and obtaining witness cooperation once again complicated prosecution. As in previous cases connected to the Black Mafia, fear and silence hindered investigators. The inability to deliver swift accountability compounded the trauma experienced by Hamas Abdul Khalis. The impact extended beyond the immediate victims. National media outlets covered the massacre extensively. The killings introduced a broader American audience to the existence of the Black Mafia and to the intersection between organized crime and ideological extremism within certain circles. The organization was no longer viewed solely as a regional narcotics syndicate. It was now associated with one of the most disturbing, religiously linked mass murders of the era. The emotional and psychological toll on Khalis did not fade. In 1977, he led what became known as the Hanafi Siege in Washington, D.C. During that incident, Khalis and his followers took hostages in multiple buildings, including the B'nai B'rith headquarters and the Islamic Center, demanding attention to the unresolved murders of his family. The siege lasted 2 days and ended after negotiations. The 1973 massacre was a direct catalyst for that crisis. The events of January 18, 1973 marked a turning point. The Black Mafia's name became tied to an act that reached beyond organized crime and into ideological vengeance. The organization had already shown it would kill over money and territory. Now it was linked to a crime that involved children and a religious dispute. National attention intensified, federal agencies increased focus, and the line between criminal enterprise and extremist violence grew harder to ignore. By 1973, the Black Mafia's violence had spread beyond Philadelphia's inner neighborhoods and into the surrounding region. The organization's control over narcotics distribution, combined with internal disputes and financial conflicts, produced a series of killings that extended into New Jersey and beyond. Each act reinforced the same message: debts would be collected, betrayal would be punished, and silence would be enforced. One of the most significant killings that year was the murder of Major Thamedji Coxon. Coxon was a prominent black gambler and narcotics trafficker. On December 31, 1973, he was shot inside his home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. The killing was carried out by Ronald Harvey and other Black Mafia members. According to records, Coxon owed approximately $200,000 from a failed heroin deal. In the drug economy of the early 1970s, that kind of loss created immediate danger. Coxon's murder reinforced the consequences of financial disputes at the highest levels of distribution. Violence tied to Eugene "Bo" Baines also surfaced in Camden, New Jersey. Hilton Stroud and Walter Tillman were both shot in Camden in 1973 after allegedly intercepting a drug shipment that had been destined for Baines. Interfering with narcotics supply lines was treated as an act of aggression. The response was swift and lethal. Contract killings became another mechanism for enforcing discipline and settling ideological or financial scores. Charles Cooper was shot to death in a West Philadelphia apartment in 1973 along with 2 women. The killing was attributed to Russell Barnes, acting under contract connected to Nation of Islam members and the Black Mafia. These arrangements illustrated the overlap between ideological disputes and organized crime interests. The year 1974 brought one of the most gruesome killings associated with the organization. George "Bo" Abney was decapitated after the Black Mafia allegedly placed a hit on him. Abney was accused of skimming narcotics proceeds from a drug distribution network formerly controlled by Thomas Cadillac Tommy Farrington. Skimming from an established network meant diverting profits from powerful figures. The manner of Abney's death sent a message that went beyond enforcement. It was designed to instill fear. Witness cooperation remained rare, and when someone was perceived as assisting authorities, retaliation followed. James Henry Bubbles Price became a tragic example. Price had been connected to the Hanafi murder case. Authorities circulated a rumor that he had turned state's evidence in an effort to pressure his cooperation. That rumor placed him in immediate danger. In 1974, while in prison, Price was tortured and hanged. His death reinforced the organization's intolerance for perceived informants, even when the accusation originated with law enforcement. The cycle continued into 1976. On June 23, 1976, Louis Gruby and his wife Yetta Gruby were executed inside their home. Louis Gruby had testified against Black Mafia members in connection with the DuBrow Furniture Store robbery. The retaliation came years after the robbery itself. Time did not erase grievances, it merely delayed repayment. That same year, James Hadley was shot at 20th and Pierce Streets in Philadelphia by Jojo Rohn over a dispute. The organization's violence was no longer confined to high-profile traffickers. Street-level conflicts could escalate with fatal results when tied to larger networks. Also in 1976, Taz Maya Taz Lang, the manager and girlfriend of Philadelphia singer Teddy Pendergrass, was shot and killed on the doorstep of her home. The Black Mafia is suspected in her murder. Reports indicated that members allegedly resented Lang's influence over Pendergrass's lucrative music career. The case remains unsolved, and while suspicion has been directed toward the organization, definitive proof linking specific individuals to the killing has not been publicly established. Between 1973 and 1976, the pattern was consistent. Drug debts, intercepted shipments, testimony in court, internal skimming, ideological disputes, each conflict carried lethal consequences. The violence crossed state lines, entered private homes, and reached into prison cells. The Black Mafia's power rested on control of narcotics and control of fear. During these years, both were exercised without hesitation. By 1973, the scale of violence and the visibility of the Black Mafia made it impossible for the organization to remain a rumor whispered on street corners. What had once operated behind intimidation and silence was now drawing sustained attention from both the press and federal authorities. That year, the Philadelphia Inquirer published reporting that described the Black Mafia as a real and structured crime syndicate. The paper rejected the idea that it was a myth or an exaggeration. It detailed a criminal organization with chains of command, enforcers, financiers, regular business meetings, and assigned territories. The reporting outlined its involvement in narcotics, extortion, murder, loan sharking, numbers, and prostitution. It described a war chest capable of financing drugs and gambling operations while paying for strong legal defense. The exposé confirmed publicly what many residents already knew privately, that a disciplined and organized syndicate had been operating in Philadelphia for years. The growing attention placed pressure on law enforcement agencies to respond with coordinated action. In September 1974, that response arrived. In the early morning hours, federal drug agents and the Justice Department's crime strike force carried out a major raid targeting the Black Mafia. 21 members and affiliates were arrested. It was one of the largest direct enforcement actions taken against the organization up to that point. The raid signaled that federal authorities were no longer treating the group as a localized gang problem, but as an organized crime entity requiring sustained intervention. Prosecutors faced a familiar obstacle. Witness intimidation had undermined previous cases. Community fear, reinforced by years of retaliatory killings, limited cooperation. To overcome that barrier, investigators increasingly relied on electronic surveillance. Wiretapping became the primary prosecutorial tool. Phone lines associated with members were monitored over extended periods, in some cases for 21 consecutive days. Recorded conversations provided evidence that did not depend on frightened witnesses taking the stand. One individual who played a controversial role during this period was Charles Robinson. Robinson was a community activist involved in a neighborhood organization that had received government grants. Over time, Black Mafia members exerted significant influence within that group. Robinson later stated that he feared for his family as the organization's control expanded. He was also reportedly concerned about the potential investigation into the use of grant funds. Robinson served as an informant, and information derived from surveillance and cooperation contributed to the federal cases. Robinson's connection to the organization was personal as well as civic. He was the brother-in-law of Black Mafia member James Fox. According to accounts, Fox had allegedly intimidated Robinson's family, including his mother. The situation illustrates the complexity of cooperation in an environment where criminal influence and community life intersected. The arrests and prosecutions in the mid-1970s fractured the original Black Mafia's centralized power. Leadership cohesion weakened. Internal trust eroded under surveillance pressure. Members faced charges ranging from heroin and cocaine distribution to rape and murder. While the organization did not disappear overnight, the aura of invulnerability began to fade. Even so, the reign of violence did not end immediately. The culture of silence that had developed in Philadelphia, often described as "stop snitching," reflected the effectiveness with which the Black Mafia had enforced fear. Wiretaps succeeded where community testimony often failed. Through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the original Black Mafia continued to operate in fragmented form. Leadership structures shifted. Some members were imprisoned. Others attempted to maintain influence through smaller, more agile configurations. The organization, in its original incarnation, continued functioning until 1984. By that point, federal pressure had altered its structure permanently. What had once been a tightly organized syndicate, with formal meetings and recorded minutes, had splintered under indictments and surveillance. The original Black Mafia's dominance had weakened, but the environment it created, disciplined drug distribution networks enforced by violence, would influence the next generation. By the mid-1980s, the original Black Mafia had fractured under indictments, surveillance, and internal strain. Its formal structure weakened, but the drug economy it helped shape continued to expand. A new force was rising in Philadelphia's streets, and it did not answer to the old hierarchy. During this period, New York-based Jamaican posses had rapidly taken control of significant portions of drug distribution in Black neighborhoods across Philadelphia. Their networks were aggressive, organized, and heavily armed. The shift in control threatened those who had grown up under the influence of the original Black Mafia. Out of that environment, a new organization began to take form. In 1985, former members and associates of the original Black Mafia organized a group of younger African-American men into what became known as the Junior Black Mafia, or JBM. The goal was clear: reclaim territory and counter the growing dominance of the Jamaican drug networks. By 1986, the group had been conceived as a structured organization. By 1987, it was operational. The founders were Aaron Jones, age 26, Mark Casey, age 23, and Leonard Patterson, age 27. All three grew up together on the streets of West Philadelphia. They shared ambition, familiarity with the drug trade, and a desire to build something that mirrored the power structures they had observed in earlier criminal organizations. Aaron Jones, in particular, was fascinated with the film The Godfather. According to associates, he saw himself in the role of a crime patriarch. Leonard Patterson was viewed as a counterpart in that cinematic hierarchy. The influence of the movie was not superficial. It shaped how they envisioned leadership, loyalty, and symbolism. The Junior Black Mafia consciously modeled itself after La Cosa Nostra and the original Black Mafia. It adopted a formalized hierarchy. It created a governing body known as the Board of Commissioners, composed of the original founding members. In theory, the board shared equal authority and made decisions by consensus. In practice, informants indicated that Aaron Jones quickly assumed a dominant position, becoming the de facto chairman. The board controlled admissions and expulsions. Prospective members had to be recommended by an original member and approved collectively. The primary requirement was not loyalty alone. It was infrastructure. Candidates needed established drug networks capable of moving large quantities of narcotics. Each member oversaw his own distribution network, often supported by a second-in-command to maintain continuity in case of arrest. Membership was exclusive. The JBM was composed entirely of young black males. Women did not hold formal positions within the organization. When involved, they operated in supporting roles, often as couriers or fronts for rentals and purchases. The racial and cultural homogeneity was deliberate, reinforcing identity and cohesion. Symbolism also mattered. Early members wore gold rings engraved with the initials JBM and encrusted with diamonds. The rings were not simply jewelry. They signified belonging and rank. They echoed the ceremonial traditions the founders admired in both Italian organized crime and the original Black Mafia. Territorially, the JBM operated across Northwest, Southwest, Southwest, and Germantown sections of Philadelphia. Leaders were assigned to specific sections, creating a geographic chain of command. What began as a loose association of ambitious dealers quickly evolved into a highly profitable drug network. The Junior Black Mafia represented a generational shift. It inherited lessons from the past, structure, ceremony, and ruthlessness, and applied them to the crack cocaine era. The foundation laid between 1985 and 1987 would soon translate into one of the most powerful and violent drug organizations Philadelphia had seen since the original Black Mafia's peak. By the late 1980s, Philadelphia was in the grip of the crack epidemic. Cocaine, processed into smaller, smokable units, flooded neighborhoods that were already shaped by years of heroin distribution. The Junior Black Mafia positioned itself at the center of that new economy. What began as an attempt to reclaim territory from Jamaican posses quickly evolved into a large-scale narcotics enterprise. At its peak, the JBM was estimated to distribute between 100 and 200 kilograms of cocaine per month. That volume placed the organization among the most significant drug networks in the region. The structure implemented in its early years allowed members to manage separate distribution systems while remaining tied to a centralized leadership. Each territory operated under a designated leader, with operations spanning Northwest, Southwest, Southwest, and Germantown sections of Philadelphia. The compartmentalized structure limited vulnerability while maximizing reach. The crack trade intensified violence. Turf boundaries were measured in blocks. Street corners translated into revenue streams. The JBM engaged in an extended drug war with the Shower Posse, a Jamaican organization that had established dominance in parts of Southwest Philadelphia. The conflict reflected more than rivalry. It was a battle for control over supply lines, retail territory, and reputation. By 1989, the JBM had been linked to 25 murders. The killings were connected to enforcement, retaliation, territorial disputes, and internal discipline. The violence mirrored the methods of the original Black Mafia, but operated within the faster, more volatile crack market. The scale of bloodshed drew renewed law enforcement attention, and federal investigations intensified. During this period, Samuel Christian, the founder of the original Black Mafia, was released from prison in late 1989. Known also as Richard Carter and Suleiman Bey, Christian attempted to reassert influence over the Junior Black Mafia. He called a meeting under the stated purpose of mediating disputes between the JBM and rival narcotics networks. According to accounts, the effort was less about peace and more about financial leverage. Christian sought to position himself as a unifying authority who could profit from both sides. The attempt ultimately failed. The generational shift in leadership was already underway, and the younger organization did not return to his control. The JBM also developed links with the Italian-American Bruno Scarfo crime family. Cooperation extended to cocaine distribution and shared contacts. Advisors such as Michael Youngblood used La Cosa Nostra connections to obtain narcotics, including cocaine and methamphetamine. In 1983, Youngblood had been indicted alongside Cowboy George Martirano, the son of Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra member Raymond Long John Martirano. Observations of JBM members meeting Italian organized crime associates at South Philadelphia locations reflected practical collaboration rather than symbolic affiliation. Despite its revenue and alliances, the organization faced mounting legal pressure. Aaron Jones, who had emerged as the dominant figure within the JBM's Board of Commissioners, was eventually convicted in connection with murders tied to the organization. He was placed on death row in Pennsylvania. His sentencing marked a decisive blow to the group's leadership. The Junior Black Mafia began to fragment around 1992. Arrests, prosecutions, and internal fractures weakened its centralized structure. What had been designed as a disciplined, symbolic organization modeled on La Cosa Nostra devolved into scattered networks. The drug trade continued in Philadelphia, but the JBM as a cohesive entity dissolved. The extended network surrounding the original Black Mafia and its successors remained associated with violence into the 1980s. In 1980, Barry Kelly was killed in retaliation for his father's incriminating testimony in a robbery and kidnapping case. That same year, Frederick Armour was shot by Laris Tank Frazier during a territorial dispute in the Richard Allen projects. These killings reflected the lingering culture of retaliation that predated the JBM and continued alongside it. By the early 1990s, the Junior Black Mafia had run its course. Its rise was fueled by the crack epidemic. Its power was enforced through murder and intimidation. Its decline came through federal prosecution, internal division, and the removal of its leadership. The structure changed, the names changed, the streets remained, and the cost, measured in lives, stayed with the city long after the organizations that caused it faded from view.